Battlegrounds is an alternative auto-battler version of Hearthstone that has borrowed a couple of cards from the base game to use as buyable minions. Some of the minions on this list, though, have since been removed or replaced in favor of fresher and more easily balanceable cards. So in this list, we'll be going over the best cards that have appeared in Battlegrounds, but more focusing on how they performed in the base mode of the game. And at number 10, we have the Savannah Highmane. This classic hunter card is a 6-mana 6/5 beast which summons 2/2 beasts when it dies, and is currently a tier 4 minion in Battlegrounds. When this card was first released in Alpha, people lost their minds over how many stats Highmane had with no downsides. In addition to having respectable stats for a 6-drop, its Death Rattle summoned minions which are also worth about 3 mana. This card was one of early Hearthstone's best cards ever due to how overwhelmingly hard it was to fully counter without taking damage. You see, Face Hunter back then was really overtuned, with some of its cards having to get nerfed upwards of 3 times, and Highmane was the finisher that ended games within a couple of turns. For those of you who don't know, early Face Hunters looked a lot differently than they do nowadays, and weren't as fast as they are now. After Starving Buzzard was nuked to become 5 mana, Hunter no longer had their best draw engine available and had to resort to playing cheap, aggressive, well-statted minions to get enough damage in before a board clear. Highmane with Leroy Jenkins were usually the only cards in that deck that cost 3 or more mana, since they were usually the only expensive cards that could reliably get damage in. Nowadays though, Highmane has been pushed out of Face Hunter decks for not doing enough, since most cards have to have immediate, on-board effects to be good rather than just being a bundle of stats. Though it has some play in niche Death Rattle Hunter decks, Highmane deserves a spot on this list for how iconic and prevalent it was in the first couple of years of Hearthstone. And at number 9, we have the Defender of Argus. This 4-mana 3/3 simply gives minions next to it +1/+1 in taunt, and is a tier 4 minion in Battlegrounds. Functionally, it's basically just Wriggling Horror and Sunfury Protector combined, but in the early days of Hearthstone, it was in a decent number of good decks. Back in the day, giving your minions +1/+1 was surprisingly good, because of how much minion-to-minion combat there was. For example, if Rivercroc was buffed by Argus and able to trade into Bloodrant Raptor, it meant you were able to kill one of your opponent's minions while forcing out another answer, letting you go +1 in card advantage. And while board clears did exist, also being able to buff your minions out of range of board clears to push for damage was a pretty respectable play. These benefits, as well as taunts to protect your damaged minions, pushed tons of Zoo decks for a while to include Argus as a semi-game closer. And while it had the chance to whiff if you didn't have enough minions on board, most decks that played this were able to swarm the board to always get Argus's full effect off. In fact, this ability to give taunt to adjacent minions, with the cherry on top of giving a +1/+1, actually helped enable Silence and Hand Warlock decks to thrive for a while. These strategies basically aimed to play cheap, large minions which either can't attack or required you to be passive for a number of turns. And after taunting your big walls to shut down aggro decks with Argus, you were free to work upwards towards your actual win condition, just like in Battlegrounds. This card would have been a higher spot on this list if not for the fact that it actually was buffed from being a 2/3 back to its original 3/3 status, and still doesn't see any play. And at number 8, we have Voidwalker. This is a 1-mana Warlock minion 1/3 that has taunt and was a tier 1 minion in Battlegrounds. At first glance, it may seem like a card this simple has no purpose being on this list, but it has been surprisingly prevalent in Warlock decks throughout history. You see, decks that want to play minions on 1 want as many stats on the minions as possible, so they can quickly finish the game out. In Hearthstone, you typically want 1 more stat than your mana cost for attack and health, with an additional minor upside. One example that was played quite a lot was Knife Juggler, which at least had 2 stats in attack and health and a major upside to dealing 1 damage whenever you summoned a minion. And when 1-mana minions follow this formula, they typically offer the best value of stats for their mana cost. Voidwalker found its home in Zoo Warlock decks, which have seen competitive success in every format until fairly recently. And keeping in mind its cost, 1 mana for 4 stats with an upside is very good, even if it isn't aggressively statted. Zoo's goal is to swarm the board with cheap, efficient cards, with stuff like Flame Imp, Possessed Villager, and even Knife Juggler. Voidwalker worked perfectly in this deck either as a solid turn 1 play, or as a fairly big taunt minion which can protect your other more fragile minions. Since then though, Voidwalker has only really seen competitive light in normal Hearthstone and in Battlegrounds, but only whenever Voidlord dies and summons 3 of them, since they have since been removed from the tavern as a buyable minion. And since Voidlord is a decent card in both formats, mainly serving as a desperate taunt minion to help you stay alive, Voidwalker is seen quite often and serves as a second layer of annoying taunts. And speaking of simple cards, at number 7 we have Righteous Protector. This 1-mana 1/1 Paladin minion was formerly a tier 1 minion in Battlegrounds and has taunt and Divine Shield, meaning enemy minions must attack it first and damage from the first hit it takes is negated. Similarly to the previous entry on this list, Righteous Protector saw play for how efficient it was at its cost. In the first couple of turns, it basically is a 1-mana 1/1 with taunt that summons another 1/1 because of its Divine Shield. And it's not really a stretch to say that any 1-mana card that summons or death rattles into another 1/1 has historically been very good. Or in the mid-game, with just a couple of buffs, Righteous Protector can quickly become a major threat because of its Divine Shield. Or, as it was most commonly used in Battlegrounds, in the late game it can serve as a crucial taunt minion which can block 2 attacks. 2 good keywords on 1-mana minions is pretty much unheard of, and because of how independently good it was, Righteous Protector found a home in almost every Paladin deck that could ever run her. Most notably though, Odd Paladin consistently ran her and saw tons of competitive success in Wild. Revolving around summoning 2 Silverhand recruits each turn with their hero power, Odd Paladin dominated the ladder for quite a long time, and ran Righteous Protector as a solid turn 1 minion, and as a way to protect all the recruits on board. Even with just 3 recruits on the board, playing Quartermaster on turn 5, which gave all of your Silverhand recruits +2/+2, was actually enough to finish the game out, even in Wild. And with her introduction to the core set, she has only continued to see more play in Standard. And at number 6, we have Mal'Ganis. This 9-mana 9/7 Warlock demon gives your other demons +2/+2, makes your hero immune to all damage, and was replaced as a tier 5 minion in Battlegrounds by Catherine Natir. When Mal'Ganis was first printed, he saw almost no play because at the time, a lot of the demons and demon synergy cards Warlocks had were pretty bad, like Demon Fuse, Felguard, and Blood Imp. They either didn't do enough for the terrible drawbacks or were just generally understated. Mal'Ganis did work well with Voidcaller, a 4-mana 3/4 that plays a random demon from your hand when it dies, but that was pretty much the only good demon support for a long time. Then in one expansion, Blizzard printed a big demon support package for Warlock, basically letting it cheat out huge demons for free. The Skull of Minari summoned a random demon from your hand at the start of your turn. Possessed Lackey summoned a random demon from your deck when it died. On top of that, Warlock was able to use Voidlord, Doomguard, and Mal'Ganis in Wild as their only demons. His effect of making your hero immune was especially good since it meant that your opponent couldn't burst you down with direct damage spells without first killing Mal'Ganis. And since the release of big demon support, other decks, like Arena Warlock, were able to finally run Mal'Ganis since it meant they often didn't need to pay the full 9 mana to get him on the field. Instead, they could play Skull, wait until they drew Mal'Ganis, and get him onto the board and resummon him with Gul'dan later in the game. And because he made your hero immune, he also prevented your hero from taking fatigue damage, meaning he became a must-kill target in the fairly common Reno-Lock versus Reno-Lock matchups back in the day. And even though Voidlord is also in Battlegrounds as a tier 5 minion, I've decided to include it with Mal'Ganis as an honorary spot, mostly because Voidlord and Mal'Ganis did very similar things, but mainly because I didn't want the number 5 spot to talk about a big demon support package again. And at number 5, we have the Anoyotron. This neutral 2-mana 1/2 has Taunt and Divine Shield and was a tier 2 Battleground minion. At first glance, this card looks very similar to Righteous Protector, with seemingly worse stats. After all, for 1 more mana, you are essentially paying for 1 more health and the mech tag. It might surprise you though, that Anoyotron has seen quite a bit of competitive success for nearly its entire lifetime, in a variety of decks. In the early days, it saw play as a fairly well-statted taunt minion that needed 2 attacks to get through, finding a home in Mech Mage, Mech Hunter, and even some control decks. But what really made this card successful over the years were its common keywords and tags. In Standard, its taunt keyword let it synergize with the very good Razormane Battleguard. Its even mana cost let it be included in Even Paladin, and was able to be pulled by Call to Arms, and protect Farwatch posts, and actually was core to 2 of the best decks of all time. For one, Anoyotron's pesky Divine Shield and Taunt actually helped enable Shutterwalk decks, an infamous and annoyingly broken deck. Basically, Shutterwalk would repeat all Battlegrounds you played for the game, and after playing some battle cries that could copy it and return cheap copies to your hand, would let you go infinite and repeat this effect. Part of this combo included Corpse Taker, which would gain a whole mess of keywords if you had a minion in your deck that had them, like Anoyotron, and would be repeated when Shutterwalk was played. It was also part of a briefly S-tier wild deck, Snip Snap Warlock. Basically, the 3-card 5-mana combo revolved around creating free infinite copies of Snip Snap in your hand and attaching the mechs, which included Anoyotron. Somehow, through all sorts of metas, Anoyotron always finds a way to be there, whether it be the core set, in Battlegrounds, or even as a playable hero. Although Anoyotron is no longer in Hearthstone Battlegrounds. And at number 4, we have Toxaphene. This neutral 1-mana 1/2 Warlock gives a friendly Murloc Poisonous, a keyword which causes any minion damaged by it to be destroyed. Toxaphene was a tier 4 minion before being removed because of how broken it was. And unlike Battlegrounds, Poisonous is really not that great due to how many token minions there are, and how poorly statted most Poisonous minions typically are. That being said, Poisonous does synergize quite well with Murlocs in the base Hearthstone game. The best Murloc deck, being Murloc Shaman, relied on swarming the board with cheap, synergistic Murlocs that could quickly overwhelm your opponent. And with cards like Spawn Pool Forager, Underbelly Angler, and Murloc Tidecaller, this was pretty easy to do. Except when your opponent played a large taunt minion, which you had to sacrifice all of your Murlocs into. With Toxafin though, a meek Murloc Tinyfin could become a threat and take down any large minion. But what really made Toxafin amazing was its excellent niche in Wild with Firemancer Flurgle to create an insanely cheap and consistent full board clear. Flurgle is a 2-mana 2/3 Murloc which deals 1 damage to all enemy minions whenever you play a Murloc. And since Hearthstone processes Battlecry effects first, then triggers whenever effects, what would happen is that you would first play Flurgle, play Toxafin, and target Flurgle. Flurgle would get poisonous, and decimate your opponent's entire board with its now poisonous effect. And with the card Ice Fishing, which draws 2 Murlocs from your deck for 2 mana, this is effectively a 3-mana 2-card combo which can very easily be drawn from your deck. It also had the benefit of creating a poisonous 2/3 Flurgle which could also trade into a large minion and threaten to wipe your opponent's board again. Of course, you always had the chance to draw one of the 2 combo pieces and limit you to only running 2 Murlocs, but it would reliably clear your opponent's board and was so good that it's been included in pretty much every Wild Reno, Combo, and Murloc Shaman deck. The only thing stopping Toxafin from being higher on this list is how reliant it is on Flurgle to be any good competitively in standard Hearthstone. And at number 3, we have Southsea Captain. Southsea Captain is a neutral 3-mana 3/3 pirate that gives all of your other pirates +1/+1, and is currently a tier 2 minion in Battlegrounds. And to no one's surprise, this card saw exclusively play in pirate decks, where all your other minions could benefit from its great effect. This card was one of the first ever printed in the game, but never really saw success until Patches the Pirate was released. This 1-mana 1/1 with charge, at the time, pulled itself from your deck for free whenever you played a pirate. A pretty common play in Pirate Warrior was to pass on turn 1, play Ship's Cannon on 2, and play Captain on 3, pulling a 2/2 Patches with charge and triggering the cannon twice. And because Patches basically made Captain a 3-mana 5/5, it saw play in a small pirate package in a ton of aggro decks, including the very good on Rogue. This deck, with the upgraded hero power, included a ton of weapon synergy cards, which happened to synergize well with pirates. And with the release of Questline Warrior, this card became a near auto-include in both Wild and Standard. You see, the pirate questline, Raid the Docks, needs you to play 8 pirates in total for the reward, with the first step requiring you to play 3 pirates, then 3, and then finally 2 more. And with so many pirates required, this deck basically had to include as many good pirates as possible to turbo out the quest as fast as possible. And even though Southsea Captain costs 3 mana and is heavily contested for deck space by other 3-mana pirates, he remains a solid choice for pirate builds that want to play around board clears and kill slower decks faster. And at number 2, we have the Vulgar Homunculus. This 2-mana 2/4 Warlock Demon has a taunt and deals 2 damage to your hero when it's played, and was formerly a tier 1 minion in Battlegrounds. And just like in Battlegrounds before its removal, this card's main allure is that it's a pretty efficient 2 mana that synergizes with self-damaging cards. For one, it was a staple card in every Zoo deck since its release as a beefier, stronger, and bigger Voidwalker. Homunculus fit Zoo deck's game plan perfectly as an overstudded minion with a minor downside, since Warlocks didn't really care about damage to themselves unless it put them into range of getting killed from the hand by direct damage spells. Where this card really shined though was in the S-tier series of Dark Glare and Questline Warlock decks, which centered on trying to cheat out as much mana as possible by abusing self-damaging cards like Homunculus. When Dark Glare first came out, it was a 3-mana 3/4 that restored 2 mana crystals whenever your hero took damage. The combo with this card, usually as early as turn 3, would be to play Dark Glare and as many cards that damage you and cost 2 mana or less, since they would basically cost no mana. Cards like Kobold Librarian and Raise Dead would draw cards and gain you mana, Spirit Bomb and Crystallizer would lower your life points for free for Molten Giants, and Vulgar Homunculus was a free 2/4, and with the introduction of the Warlock questline, which could effectively deal infinite damage, Dark Glare Warlock along with Vulgar Homunculus became that much stronger. This deck was so good in Wild, in fact, that it actually caused the Demon Seed to be the second card ever to be banned from Wild, with Homunculus playing a part in being able to complete the quest before turn 5. And if it weren't for how prevalent and game-winning the next card could be sometimes, Homunculus could have definitely taken the number 1 spot, even though the card was removed from Battlegrounds because it was actually pretty terrible in that version of the game. And at number 1, we have Bran Bronzebeard. This 3-mana 2/4 doubles all of your Battlecry effects, which are most on-play effects, and is a current tier 5 minion in Battlegrounds. Bran is another fan favorite, and for good reason. This card basically made a ton of value-centered decks way stronger by essentially doubling the value you got from some cards. And with his fellow set mate Reno, ushered in a new wave of control decks. Even though Bran and Reno didn't synergize directly with each other, They did both help control decks by offering even more value in control matchups, and survivability against aggro decks. Value, for those of you who don't know, is a term Hearthstone players use to talk about cards that do more than perform above their mana cost, or generate more mana than they cost. Often by making high impact plays on the board or by generating new cards. Whether it be by discovering more potions, drawing more cards, invoking more, creating stronger board clears, gaining more armor, or whatever else, there were endless uses for Bran depending on the matchup you were up against. And as a 3-mana 2/4, he could contest the board against aggro decks and was often a must-kill target. And what's funny is that he was useful in tons of control, combo, and some aggro decks. Like mentioned earlier, a vast majority of Hearthstone cards have battle cries, to the point where it's rare to find a deck that doesn't run a good handful of battle cry minions. Some of the most creative and competitive uses for Bran, though, were to summon 4 Boom bots with Dr. Boom to push for lethal, draw 4 cards with Cold Light Oracle to kill your opponent with Fatigue, or to pull 2 minions from your opponent's hand with Dirty Rat while your opponent had a Doomsayer up. Needless to say, Bran had tons of uses and was one of the hardest cards to play optimally. But when he was just about one of the best cards in the game. It's hard to understate just how prevalent and good Bran was in every meta he was in, even if he never enabled an S-tier deck. But because of his inclusion in so many busted decks, he definitely deserves to be at the top of this list, and is also just as good over in Battlegrounds. Alright, and that's the list. If you have any ideas for future videos similar to this one, we'd love to hear about them down in the comments.